Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. So, you want to get into the weeds on something that's been getting a ton of buzz lately, right?
Mm,
Intermittent fasting, it seems like everyone's talking about it, but today we're zeroing in on how it specifically applies to folks managing diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. And we've got this really interesting research paper that dives into how doctors are actually using intermittent fasting with their patients who have diabetes.
right. And the cool thing about this paper is it highlights this gap in official medical guidelines,
Yeah.
There's all this hype around intermittent fasting for losing weight and feeling better overall. But when it comes to diabetes specifically, there's not a lot of solid evidence-based guidance out there yet.
Right, right. So this paper is kind of laying the groundwork, mapping out what we know so far, and offering some expert advice in an area where there aren't really any set protocols.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we jump into all the findings and what they mean, let's back up for a sec. Why is intermittent fasting even appealing to someone who's dealing with diabetes?
Well, I think the biggest draw for a lot of people is the potential for weight loss.
Makes sense.
We know that shedding some pounds can make a big difference in controlling blood sugar, especially for those with type 2.
For sure.
And then there's this hope for some people that it might even help them cut back on their diabetes meds, maybe even insulin.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So the researchers actually acknowledge this in the paper. They say there's all this interest out there. But a lot of the advice floating around isn't really rooted in solid research. It's often based on animal studies or just anecdotal stuff.
Interesting. So today we're really going to dig into the conclusions of this research and what does it all actually mean?
Exactly.
All right, so let's get to that core takeaway. What's the big picture message the researchers are trying to get across when it comes to intermittent fasting and diabetes?
I'd say the main message is to approach it with caution, but like a thoughtful kind of exploration. The research does acknowledge that there have been some smaller studies in humans showing that intermittent fasting can lead to weight loss and even a decrease in insulin needs for some people with diabetes.
Hmm,
But what they really emphasize is that we still need a lot more research to understand the long-term effects.
gotcha. So there's potential, but we got to be careful and see how things play out over time.
Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned being cautious. I remember reading in the paper that a lot of the initial excitement around intermittent fasting stemmed from animal research. Is that what you're referring to?
Absolutely. They make a really strong point that a lot of the early hype came from studies done on animals. And while those studies can be helpful for pointing us in the right direction for future research in humans, we can't just assume that what works in a lab rat will automatically translate to how it affects a person with diabetes.
Right, right. Different systems.
Exactly.
Uh,
Human physiology is way more complex.
So basically, we don't have the full picture yet when it comes to the long-term impact and safety for people with diabetes.
That's right. The paper really stresses the need for more research into the long-term effects, especially when it comes to heart health.
Oh, that's important,
Yeah, because, people with diabetes are already at a higher risk for heart disease.
right?
So understanding how intermittent fasting might affect that risk over time is really crucial. And we just don't have enough solid data in humans yet to give any definitive answers.
So it sounds like the key is to be excited about the possibilities, but also realistic about the fact that we need more long-term data in humans.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
And for both doctors and for you listening, it's really important to keep those limitations in mind if you're thinking about trying intermittent fasting.
Absolutely. We need to balance the potential benefits with the fact that there are still a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, like what are the potential risks that might not show up until further down the road?
Exactly.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom, right? I remember the conclusion had a more positive side to it as well.
Oh, you're totally right. There's a really important takeaway for people who are interested in trying this.
Okay, good.
The researchers conclude that with careful management from your doctor, like making adjustments to your diabetes medications and really keeping a close eye on your blood sugar levels, intermittent fasting can be done safely for people with diabetes.
So it's not a no, but it's a yes with a lot of caveats.
Exactly. It has to be done under the guidance of your healthcare team. You definitely don't want to try this on your own.
That makes a lot of sense.
And they actually go into detail about how different types of diabetes meds might need to be adjusted depending on the specific intermittent fasting plan you're following.
Interesting.
So it really highlights how important it is to have a personalized approach,
Mm.
taking into account the type of diabetes you have, the specific fasting schedule you're using, and all the medications you're currently taking.
Right. So it's not one size fits all.
Not at all. And another thing they emphasize is the importance of constantly checking your blood sugar.
Oh, right, because of the risk of going too low.
Right, exactly, especially if you're on insulin or sulfonylureas.
Okay, so this really underscores the point you made earlier about people with diabetes not being the average person when it comes to fasting research. Their bodies just work differently, right?
Exactly.
I remember the paper talked about something called the metabolic switch and how it might be different for someone with
Oh,
diabetes.
yeah, that's a key difference.
Can you explain that a bit more?
So the metabolic switch is basically when your body shifts from using glucose for energy to using fat.
Okay.
But in people with insulin resistance, which is common in type 2 diabetes, this switch can be delayed
Why is that?
because their bodies aren't as responsive to insulin signals, which tell the body to use glucose.
I see.
So they might end up relying on glucose for energy longer than someone without diabetes. And we're still figuring out what all this means when it comes to managing intermittent fasting in people with diabetes.
So for our listeners who really want to understand this research and how it applies to them, what's the most important question they should be asking based on these conclusions?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
I think the most crucial thing is to talk to your doctor and ask them, given my specific diabetes management plan, the meds I'm taking, how my blood sugar usually fluctuates, and my overall health, what specific adjustments and monitoring strategies would I need to make to stay safe and healthy if we were to explore intermittent fasting?
That's a good one.
It's really about having an informed conversation with your doctor so you can make the best decision for you.
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to wrap up. So much good info here today, everyone. Be sure to check back next week for another deep dive.
See you then.